Okay, so for those online you can't see, but we are in an exciting new location, 1 week only, due to the building works. Okay, so we're starting a new, having completed our series on the Gaonim, we're starting a new mini series in which I wish to look at the Baal Shem Tov, his life and times, and his ideas, and Chassidus in general. I want to try and present the Baal Shem Tov in the context of general history, the Baal Shem Tov in the context of Jewish history, and in the context of other spiritual movements at the time. Some spiritual movements of which we know little, like the general Baal Shem movement, movements that we know a lot about and are problematic, like the Sabbatean movement and the Frankist movement, that were roughly concurrent with the Baal Shem Tov or his leading disciples. And I'd also like to try and share a little bit about what we know about the Baal Shem Tov, what's genuinely historical, what's legendary and fictional and hagiographic. What do we actually know about him? How much can we know about the historical figure of the Baal Shem Tov? And then I would like, obviously, to speak a lot about his ideas. And clearly, whoever and whatever exactly he was, and whatever we do or don't know about him, clearly he was someone who inspired people in an exceptional way, in an unusual way. And his ideas, at least as filtered through the works of his students, impacted the Jewish world for all time. It is probably true to say now that the largest single group within the Orthodox world is the Hasidic world. It is probable that here in the UK, Chassidim have now taken, are now the majority of Orthodox Jews here in the UK. That's probably a shift that's happened in the last 20 years. So this is a vibrant movement that has an enormous impact. And then I'll try and talk about a sample of his teachings, what we know of his teachings, and then finally look at the longer term impact of his teachings, his legacy, the controversy, Chassidus, neo-Chassidus, and sort of developments in the movement. So that's quite an ambitious sort of project, but I think it's worth doing for Chassidus. It's obviously, and I hope this won't be just a sort of history thing. I hope it won't just be philosophy. I hope that the ideas will speak to us and impact on us spiritually, because these are profoundly important ideas. As a non-Chassid, I say nonetheless, these ideas that should touch our soul and should influence us in hopefully in good spiritual ways. So, just to give a little sort of timeline, the Baal Shem Tov is born in 1698, approximately. We don't know exactly, and dies in 1760. That we do know exactly because by the end of his life he's famous. We often know the death date of famous people better than the birth date for obvious reasons. He flourishes in the Ukraine pretty much, areas in which he exists. Times with Poland, at times with Ukraine, famously East European borders and many other areas of Europe, the borders constantly shifting. But broadly speaking, he's operating in the Ukraine. And his name is Rabbi Yisroel. His father's name is Eliezer. And he, by the end of his life, he becomes known as the Baal Shem Tov and obviously a very influential, impactful leader. Let's try and contextualize his life in the context of other great events going on, because broadly speaking, as we've tried to establish in other times in this series, you have to be the right person at the right time for your ideas to take off. He clearly was a remarkable figure. No one has such an impact in the world without being an unusual person. So clearly he's an outstanding, remarkable figure, but he also has to have a receptive audience. And the time has to be ripe for his revolution to take off. A revolution can't happen at very stable times when people are very content and happy. No matter how brilliant your ideas are, and no matter how creative you are, no matter how impactful you are, your ideas can't take off unless the time is ripe for these ideas. And he's living in a time of massive change. So his ideas have, it's a time of revolution, it's a time of struggle, it's a time when there's a lot of suffering in the Jewish world, it's a time when there's questioning and seeking answers, a time of seeking spirituality, a time of rejection of current models of spirituality. And as a result, his ideas hit the Jewish world and impact on it significantly, and of course also arouse controversy. So what is it in his life and times that mean that he is so impactful? So I'm just going to really try and summarize a little bit about him and some of the terms associated with him, like Baal Shem, Baal ShemTov, and Chassidus. So disruption in the Jewish world. Again, Baal Shem Tov born in 1698, let's say, 200 years earlier, 1492, and then 1498, the completion of the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula, 1492 from Spain. So the Sephardi world is in a state of chaos. 200 years on, it hasn't fully settled down. We spent time talking about the Beis Yosef and the Ramah and others, but this is certainly been an upheaval in the Sephardi world. And one of the things we've discussed previously is that with the expulsion from Spain, the Sephardi world moves very significantly away from rationalist or philosophical ways of thinking about Judaism to mysticism significantly. Certainly the Sephardim that move towards the Middle East and the like follow that path. So there are mystical forces at work in the Sephardi world. The Arizal, who, I can't remember if we've ever done Arizal as a topic in his own right, maybe we should probably do him, born in 1534, short life, dies in 1572. So he's dies, roughly 120 years before the birth of the Baal Shem Tov. And obviously with the Arizal, there's a systemization of Kabbalah. Kabbalistic works begin spreading more widely and become more diffused and more learned. And that's again a second preparatory step necessary for the rise of Chassidus. Then, very shortly before the birth of the Baal Shem Tov, you have a terrible and tragic upheaval in East Europe, which are in Ukraine particularly, where the Baal Shem Tov is operating, to the Chalmanetsky riots, pogroms, massacres. Again, I don't know if we've discussed in detail the Chalmanetsky massacres. Numbers differ widely as to how many deaths it caused. Certainly, though, it was beyond traumatic for the Eastern European communities and left them scarred and reeling with the destruction, literal physical destruction of communities, with a terrible death toll. Though there's a debate exactly how terrible, and an enormous cultural shock and trauma. To put this again in context, East Europe had been going through its first golden age for the 200 years before the Chalmanetsky massacre. Western Europe had had struggles. Eastern Europe had flourished. The Jews had been invited over by Kazimir to Poland. The Polish king wanted to develop the East European, the Polish economy. The Jews provided an educated middle class, and Jewish communities had been flourishing. And with the Chalmanetsky massacres, 1648 to 1657, Chmelnytsky is not just interested in Jews. He is a nationalist interested in rebelling against his overlords. But in the process of so doing, Jews get blamed and massacred, partly because it's just generally a wild time and a time of warfare and upheaval, and partly because Jews are seen as the interface between the overlords and the serfs, and therefore they're blamed for some of the upheaval. But it's a time of terrible suffering and leads the Eastern European communities to trauma, and also to a seeking of meaning and explanations. And very often mysticism is turned to as at these times. I want to clarify, I use the language here of sort of a retreat to mysticism. I don't mean that in a value judgment way. I'm not chas v'shalom judging between the different streams of Jewish thought, the philosophical and rationalist tradition, the Kabbalistic tradition. I'm just making statements of fact, which is that when people are suffering, they often turn to mystical answers to explain what's going on. Then there is another trauma that takes place across the Jewish world, following the Chalmanetsky massacres, and this is the Shabtai Tzvi debacle. So I don't think we've ever done Shabtai Tzvi in this series either. We really have to do Shabtai Tzvi also. I said when I began the series of Jewish thinkers that these weren't necessarily always going to be good thinkers. These are thinkers that impact on the Jewish world, and Shabtai Tzvi has an enormous impact on the Jewish world. So again, just a brief revision of Shabtai Tzvi's life. Shabtai Tzvi, born 1626, dies 1676 at age 50. He is charismatic beyond words, talented beyond imagination, an extraordinary figure. He's a Kabbalist, a mystic, possibly, as far as we can tell, suffering from bipolar, and swings between depression and exhilaration and euphoria. That's an attempt to reread the description of his life using modern sort of analysis, psychological analysis. Either way, he is beyond charismatic, draws a band of followers to him who are enormously talented. He's a Kabbalist, seemingly a profound Kabbalist and profound thinker, though at some later stage in his life he drifts towards what we can call pseudo-Kabbalah and leaves what we would say is orthodox Kabbalah. But he's a Kabbalist, a creative Kabbalist, and he teaches and popularizes spirituality, and at some stage or other begins claiming to be Moshiach. Now, we need to look in more detail at his life when we go through it. Suffice it to say that the percentage of Jews who believe his claim is very high. And this is somewhat covered up, censored in later sources because of the extreme embarrassment. But his impact on the Jewish world is phenomenal. And of course, the eventual outcome is disaster. He isn't Moshiach, and he converts to Islam. And for 200, 300 years afterwards, or even longer, the legacy of his messianic claims linger. Okay, how do they linger? So this isn't a series about Shabtai Tzvi, we don't have time to go into it in detail, but a number of outcomes result. One outcome is he popularizes mysticism and is an influence in spreading mysticism because his charisma and his teachings spread. A second outcome is he leads a retreat from mysticism. People say, look, mysticism has gone so bad, it's done such damage, it's out of control, the masses shouldn't learn mysticism, and therefore there's a retreat from mass Kabbalistic learning. It creates suspicion in the Jewish world of mystical revolutionary movements. And again, we're going to see that Chassidim are accused of being another Sabbatean sect. And a lot of the suspicion around Chassidism is because superficially it looks too much like Sabbateanism. Obviously, we know it isn't, but it does look a bit like that. It's got a charismatic leader who's publicizing mystical ideas, who's making messianic claims in a certain shape or form, and we'll see that Chassidism and messianism are in some ways intertwined. So that's part of the accusation against Chassidism, not just against Chassidism, but there is general one can almost say paranoia against any mystics and against any charismatic mystics. And there are a range of attacks for 200 years after Shabtai Tzvi, in which figures are accused of being Sabbatean. Famously, the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, perhaps the most acclaimed mystic or most mass-learned mystic of all time, maybe. Most of us who don't learn the works of the Arizal, but we'll all learn the Mussar and the philosophy of the Ramchal. I think we did cover the Ramchal, possibly not. Maybe we need to do the Ramchal also. The Ramchal is accused of being a neo-Sabbatean. So there's a terrible impact on the Orthodox world. It creates skepticism against rabbinic authority. After the Sabbatean debacle, people say, "Oh, so the rabbis can get things wrong." Now, for the sake of clarity, rabbis never get anything wrong. It's a joke, Charles. Sorry. But it creates terrible skepticism, and this is a time when modernity is beginning to make inroads into Europe. And it's certainly one of the things that paves the way for the rise of Enlightenment, Jewish Enlightenment, eventually leading to reform and the like, because when there's been such machlokas racking the Jewish world, it does damage. And the subsequent attacks of one rabbi against another, in which they're accusing each other of Sabbateanism, further weakens rabbinic authority. So, again, I know this is rare, but occasionally rabbis argue. And all of this leads a terrible impact on the from world. And the final point is to mention, there are genuine neo-Sabbatean movements flourishing in the Jewish world. So as extraordinary as we find it, as we would think about it, and from the vantage point of 2026, for hundreds of years after Shabtai Tzvi's conversion to Islam, his charisma is such that there are still people that believe his messianic claim. So you have Frankism arising. We'll talk about Jacob Frank later in this topic. You have to this day crypto-Sabbatean sects undercover in tiny corners and pockets of the Jewish world. Again, we'll do Shabtai Tzvi as a topic, and we'll discuss this. It's unbelievable the impact of one figure who from any historical perspective was a profoundly damaged, flawed, crazed individual, and yet his impact is enormous. I'll take your point in 1 minute, Charles. So all I want to say is, as by way of historic background, we have the upheaval of the expulsion from Spain only 200 years before. We have the Chalmonetsky massacres only 100 years before. We have the rise of and popularization of Kabbalah only 150 years before, the Arizal. And then we have Shabtai dies 20 years, less than 20 years before the birth of the 20 years before the birth of the Baal ShemTov. So we have Sabbateanism there just before the rise of the Baal ShemTov. All of this laying the groundwork for a mystical, Kabbalistic revolution, which is what Hasidus is, because people are seeking mysticism, but also suspicious of mysticism, upheaval, pain, trauma, economic downturn, economic uncertainty. All of this lays the groundwork for both the rise of the Baal Shem Tov movement and the opposition to the Baal Shem Tov movement. So we can only understand everything else we're going to talk about by understanding these sort of currents at work in the Jewish world. We've now reached the Baal Shem Tov. I'm going to go forward in time in a minute, but I see Charles wants to say something to talk about the spreading of Chassidus, just to give a very brief overview of the spreading of Chassidus, and then we'll turn back and begin looking at all of this in much more detail. Charles, sorry.
The outside world broke when Shabbat speaking. Well, this is the middle of this involvement in the Christian world. And they have an influence as well, the rise of Chassidut.
Yes.
The mystical movement there.
Yes.
I believe that their second coming was coming in exactly the time that Shabbat came to that.
Yes. So, yes. So I mentioned in my introduction, we'll talk about Jewish context of the rise of the Baal Shem Tov and general context. So we'll get to general context of the rise of the Baal Shem Tov. Just to mention it briefly, since Charles is correctly flagging it, the extreme messianic fervor and sweeping across large populations is not just a Jewish phenomena. There are parallel Christian phenomena and also parallel Islamic phenomena going on. So this isn't just this is a time of general ferment. I'll just remind you of the years we're talking about, right? The Baal Shem Tov is 1698 to 1760. So we're talking about a time of the modernity is beginning to make inroads into areas where there are large Jewish populations. We're not that far off the Protestant Revolution, Luther. We're not that far off the rise of the Renaissance in Italy, which slowly makes its way into Northern Europe and gradually begins creeping into even towards Poland. In some respects, Poland always hovers uneasily between being a Western European country and an Eastern European country, and a lot of Polish history can only be understood in that context. But Krakow and places like that are seats of Renaissance learning, Krakow University. So Ukraine, which is a backwater, is only picking up very, very little trickles of this, but eventually Poland becomes the heartlands of Chassidus, and encroaching modernity is having an effect. So there's a lot of general ripeness for revolution in the air. If we move on from the Baal Shem Tov's life, the Baal Shem Tov dies, as I said, in 1760. In 1720, a genius called Reb Eliyahu is born in and flourishes in Vilna, the famous Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon lives from 1720 to 1792, so he's a generation younger than the Baal Shem Tov, but overlaps the Baal Shem Tov, and of course he's associated with the leadership of opposition to the Baal Shem Tov's movement to Chassidus. The Baal Shem Tov attracts an array of students to him. The most famous of the first generation of students of the Baal Shem Tov are two names, the Reb Dov Ber, or the Maggid of Mezeritch, and Reb Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, known as the Toldos Yaakov Yosef. So why am I singling out these two figures? We'll look at them in more detail later, but the Baal Shem Tov has two students who publicize his work, and through them Chassidus spreads. Reb Dov Ber is a Maggid. A Maggid means a speaker, lahagid. A Maggid is a well-known position in East Europe. It's basically a darshan, a drasha giver who goes around from place to place. So the Rav of the city traditionally would focus on psak halacha and maybe communal leadership, and visiting Maggidim would wander around from place to place giving drashas. The Rav didn't have to give a drasha; that was the job of the Maggid. And the Baal Shem Tov has a student, the Maggid, who teaches students and organizes them into Hasidic groups in different areas. So the Maggid of Mezeritch is, if you like, the translator and transmitter of the Baal Shem Tov's Torah orally, the teacher of the next generation, and the organizer of Hasidus. Out of him emerges all the students who who will found the next generation of Chassidus, and I'll mention the name. And the other student, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, is an author. He writes the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, which is the written record of the Torah of the Baal ShemTov, and has a vast number of direct quotes from his great teacher, the Baal ShemTov. Perhaps 800 times he will reference, "This is what I heard from my Rebbe, this is what I heard from my Rebbe, this is what I heard from my teacher." So between the two, the Torah of Chassidus spreads. So again, just to give us a sort of timeline, the Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760. The Maggid of Mezeritch dies in 1772, so he's only one generation younger than Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoy dies in 1782. So again, just 20 years after the death of the Baal Shem Tov. So this is the first generation of Hasidic leaders. And out of them emerges an array of figures who everyone has heard of, who are the great founders of vast regions of Hasidic influence. You have Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who we now would think of as the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. Of course, it wasn't Lubavitch, named Lubavitch at the time. You have Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev, the famous Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev. About all the stories are told about how he comes to the defense of the Jewish people. You have Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk, the Noam Elimelech. People visit his keva in Lezhensk. And then you have others who are less well known but equally influential. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, who moves to Tveria and brings Hasidus over to Eretz Yisrael, and an array of important figures. Concurrent with this, the third generation of Hasidim, in other words, the students of the Maggid of Mezeritch and the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, is a figure called Jacob Frank, 1726 to 1791, who founds a neo-Sabbatean movement called Frankism, which is an appalling movement, a shockingly horrible movement. But again, for reasons that are incredibly unclear in hindsight, but we have some knowledge of, is it has impact on the Jewish world. And Chassidus, part of the opposition to Chassidus is accusations that they are Frankists, that they are neo-Sabbateans of that sort. Okay, I hope this hasn't overwhelmed everyone, but just in terms of context, the Baal Shem Tov is a spiritual revolutionary who introduces a new way of thinking about Jewish spirituality, and is enormously impactful because it's a time of revolution, because it's a time of questioning, it's a time of seeking, it's a time of pain and trauma. But most importantly, he's enormously influential because he's the Baal Shem Tov, because he teaches Torah that is remarkable and speaks to people. It's always important not to get over caught up in contextualization, but to realize that there's something here that we need to study that wows people in an incredible way. Just to give us an idea of statistics, by the way, academics think that within 50 years after the death of the Baal Shem Tov, 50% of Jewry in Russia and Poland are Hasidic. So that's how impactful it is. By the way, I should have mentioned another context that also influences the spread of Hasidus is, of course, printing. So printing has already started earlier in the late 1400s, but a large number of printing presses are set up, Jewish printing presses are set up in East Europe at the time, and that's also helpful in spreading Hasidus. Okay. What do we know about the Baal Shem Tov's life? Did he even exist? This used to be, when I was young, this used to be an academic question. We have no direct evidence of him existing. All we have are his students quoting him, so maybe the Baal Shem Tov didn't even exist at all. I think this is a ridiculous question, personally. Remarkable students who are great Jewish leaders and tzaddikim, and the idea that they are creating this figure out as a figment of their imagination is just shocking, and an example of academia going ridiculously far in its belief that only written records have any historicity, and you can't rely at all on oral records. It is true that oral records can be notoriously unreliable when it comes to dates, and oral records can be channeled through people's later perceptions, and therefore, you can question, is every detail, is every record, is every story accurate? These are perfectly good historical questions to ask. But the idea that someone so impactful and so vibrant and it didn't exist at all is a nonsense question, but it was asked by academics. We now know, even from an academic perspective, that he absolutely existed. There's been a lot of research over the last 20 years, a lot of digging through archives in Ukrainian records and the like. There's an academic called Rossman. Anyone who wants to Google him or read his book later can do so. And he even found the Baal Shem Tov's tax records. So we have enormous amounts of now records. His Siddur has been found, and he's got his own handwritten notes in it, and other such things. Why do we have his records, his tax records? Because taxes were charged on the community, and he was offered a reduced or no tax rate at times because he was a scholar and a doctor. And we'll come back to this, but in the tax records, he's referred to as Dr. Yisroel Baal Shem. So he's there in the tax records. He didn't have a PhD, he wasn't a medical doctor either, but he was a healer, and we're going to come back to that later. And therefore, someone who healed Jewish and non-Jewish citizens of Mezeritch, and therefore is referred to in the non-Jewish tax records as doctor. What else do we have of the Baal Shem Tov? Not a lot. He didn't write, or at least we don't have much of his writings. However, we have an incredible letter from the Baal Shem Tov, which is widely viewed by academia as authentic. Certainly the Hasidic world takes it as authentic. An academic consensus is that it's authentic. And I will be sharing this letter with you. I might even bring a print out of it. It's a most astounding letter. It's phenomenal to read because it is a first-person account by one of the most influential Jewish figures of all time and a mystic of their own mystical experiences. So we have a letter that Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem is writing to his brother-in-law in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Gershon Kitova. And in this letter, he describes mystical experiences, an aliyas neshama, where the soul ascends to the heavens. And it's just mind-blowing that we have this chus of reading a first-person account of the Baal Shem Tov's own internal world. It's just staggering. So we have one thing directly from the Baal Shem Tov, which is his letter, and that's pretty much it. That's what we have from the Baal Shem Tov, but it's an astounding letter. It's just unbelievable. And within this room and beyond, there's going to be an array of views about what to make of mystical experiences. I'm not going to go into that, but what we do have is a mystic's internal description of their own mystical experiences, which is absolutely mind-blowing. What else do we have from the Baal Shem Tov? Hundreds of quotes. As I mentioned in the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, written by Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of HaTanya, his Talmud who met him, we have more than 800 quotes of the Baal Shem Tov directly. And as far as we can tell, there's no reason to doubt any of these quotes. Many cases he will say, this particular quote I didn't hear directly from him, I heard it from another fellow student. On occasions he'll say, I don't remember the exact wording of the Baal Shem Tov, but this is my understanding of the idea. So when you see someone who's writing a sefer where they are doing their best to convey accurately their Rebbe's words, they revere their Rebbe's words, and they point out when they heard it indirectly or directly, they point out when they heard when they're recalling what to the best of their ability, the exact words their Rebbe said, and when they're aware that they're only recording the idea, but not the exact words, that lends a weight to these quotes. Now, again, I'm trying to be historical here, which is, at the end of the day, we don't know if these quotes are word for word. We don't know if they're 100% understanding of teachings get translated into the minds of the student. That's a fact. Nonetheless, we have a student who is a great student, a phenomenal student, who's doing their best to try and convey accurately as possible their Rebbe's teachings, and therefore it makes sense for us to assume that this conveys to a high percentage the actual views of the Baal Shem Tov. Can we say it conveys his views at 100%? No, because it always gets filtered through the minds of a listener, but it's an attempt to convey the Baal Shem Tov's views. So we have these 800 quotes, and then we have a range of oral traditions of the Chassidic movement, which were later collected into a hagiographical work called the Shivchei HaBaal Shem Tov, which was published about 130 years after the Baal Shem's death. So hagiography is it's a sneering academic term for work written by followers of a great person in which they're only interested in praising their great mentor. And the Shivrei Baal Shem Tov forms firmly into that genre. It's very titled Shivrei Baal Shem Tov, praise in praise of the Baal Shem Tov. It's a collection of stories in praise of the Baal Shem Tov. And since it was written 130 years later by a figure who went around collating Hasidic tales, it's difficult to take the stories with 100% certainty. What do they reflect? They certainly reflect what people were saying about the Baal Shem Tov 130 years later. You get the classic line, they don't tell stories about you and me like that. Well, at least about me, I can't say about anyone else. But when you have someone whose stories like that are being told, it indicates the awe and reverence that they have of him. And probably if we had a way of filtering it and determining it, we could say that some of the stories, many of the stories are true, but maybe not all of the stories. Some of the stories maybe have exaggerations, maybe some of the stories got lost over time. Oral storytelling is notoriously can get corrupted, and people can put in stories that reflect their current views and the like. So it's not something that we can take with 100% reliability, but it gives us a feel of the type of things going on in the Baal Shem Tov's circle. That's probably the most we can say about that. Sorry, Peter, were you waiting to ask something? No. Okay. So this is what we have of the Baal Shem Tov. We have some historical documents, including boring things like tax records. We have one piece of incredible writing, the Baal Shem Tov. We have very, very reliable sets of quotes from his first generation of students, and then we have less reliable quotes and stories from later generations, which sort of over time will obviously become, as time passes, oral transmission sort of loses some degree of reliability, but nonetheless give us some indication of what the Baal Shem Tov was and what he did. Let's now try and sorry, yes. No, sorry. Okay, let's try and talk about the Baal Shem Tov and understand in a spiritual sense how to contextualize him. So I want to talk about the meaning of two terms. I want to talk about the meaning of the word Baal Shem, and I want to talk about the meaning of the word Baal Shem Tov, and I also want to talk about the meaning of the word Chassidus. So let's start with Chassidus. What is this movement that the Baal Shem Tov launches? We don't know, by the way, if the Baal Shem Tov set out to create a new movement. He may well have thought of himself as simply a teacher of Torah, and it may only be the next generation that became conscious that there was something so revolutionary in this that began coalescing into a sort of separate movement. It's possible that the opposition to Chassidus is in a sense what made it into a movement. Had there not been opposition to Chassidus, it's possible that Chassidim wouldn't have thought of themselves as their own discrete group. They've just thought of themselves as Jews with particular spiritual ideals and influence and the like. I don't want to overuse this comparison, but if we look at the Sephardi world, there were figures in the Sephardi world that were somewhat contemporary with the Baal Shem Tov, who also began mass teaching of Kabbalistic ideas with some overlap with the Baal Shem Tov's thinking, and it never became a separate movement. It was simply, you open a Chumash, and some people will open the Chumash and like looking at the Zafano's explanation, and other people open the Chumash and like looking at the Orach Chaim's explanation. Now, they represent very different ways of looking at the world, but we don't think of students of Orach Chaim as their own movement within Judaism. And the reason I'm mentioning the Orach Chaim is because Orach Chaim is roughly contemporaneous with the Baal Shem Tov, and there's a lot of overlap in their ideas. The Baal Shem Tov was aware of the Orach Chaim's teachings in some particular way or other, and to this day, Chassidim love the Perush of the Orach Chaim because it speaks to their soul. It's in many ways a Chassidish work, even though obviously that's a ridiculous term because it's Sephardi living in North Africa and then dying in Eretz Yisroel and buried on Har Hazeisim. But the Orach Chaim doesn't become a new movement, partly because his ideas aren't as revolutionary as the Baal Shem Tov, but perhaps partly because there wasn't organized opposition to it. It's just some Jews liked it and some Jews didn't. So we could imagine a very different Jewish history in which the Baal Shem Tov's teachings became just part of the canon of Jewish ideas. And by definition, some people are going to like them. Some people they're going to speak more to some people. Some people won't like them as much. But it's not obvious it has to become a new movement. Why did it become a new movement? Well, the next generation, the first generation of students of the Baal Shem Tov, particularly the Maggid and Mezeritch, who is an organizer and a systemizer, creates it into a new movement. He doesn't want his ideas of his Rebbe, his great Rebbe, to become lost or watered down, and therefore he creates a structure of dissemination of the movement, which therefore becomes, in a sense, its own collection of body of Jews, and Chassidim begin thinking of themselves as separate sort of communities. And now within every city and town and across East Europe, you have two communities, the non-Chassidim and the Chassidim, and they sort of begin thinking of themselves as a separate group with their own shuls and the like. Had there not been opposition, then Lav Dafka would have developed in the same way. Who knows if it would have developed in the same way and become its own sort of concrete movement? We don't know. But certainly within the Baal Shem Tov himself, we don't know that he set out to create a revolutionary movement. But what did emerge eventually is a movement that calls itself Chassidism. Where does this term Chassidus come from? So I want to make another point over here, which is all revolutionary Jewish thinkers in Judaism always express themselves in what we can call the new old or the old new. No Jewish thinker can achieve credibility unless, in some shape or form, what they are saying is grounded in tradition, in Masorah. Um, on the one hand. On the other hand, if they are innovating and bringing something new in, then clearly they have to be saying something new also. So what are they doing? They're always taking classic Jewish ideas and perhaps putting a different emphasis on them, putting the balance between them a little differently, tweaking them, giving a new way of looking at them. If you learn a Chassidish Sefer, it's full of Mamori Chazal, of Midrashim, of Haggadah Gemaras, of regular Gemaras, of lines from Shulchan Aruch, and it's using the same classic sources as everyone else is using. So all movements are on new old. The Baal ShemTov isn't a revolutionary in the sense of I'm creating a new spiritual pathway, a new ideas. Who can you really do that? Can you argue with Chazal and the Rishonim and so on? But the Baal ShemTov is saying I'm putting different emphasis on things. I'm giving new ways of thinking about classic ideas and the like. So when I talk in a moment about the term Chassidus, I want us to understand that there's always been the term Chassidus around. There've always been Chassidim around, but Chassidim very different to what the term came to mean in amongst the followers, the third generation of or second and third generation of followers of the Baal ShemTov. So the word chassid is a classic word. It appears in it simply means in the classic sense someone who does chesed. HaKadosh Baruch is described as a chassid. He does chesed, and various figures in history were described as chassidim if they did chesed. By the Mishnaic era, it ceased to mean simply someone who does chesed, but also meant someone who was adopting additional or extra pietic practices, was taking on chumras, stringencies, hidurim, beautification of mitzvahs, maybe mystical practices and the like. Someone who's doing lifnim meshuras hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. Why does Chassidus mean that? Why does the word chesed, which means kindness, come to mean going beyond the letter of the law? The answer is because chesed always contrasts with din. Din is someone who is justice. You come and approach me for kindness, for favor. I say, do I owe it to you? Am I responsible? If I owe you the money, fine, take me to Din Torah, right? I'll you want kindness from me. Kindness is always overflowing. It's always breaking the boundaries. Din is regimented and structured and legalistic, and chesed is overflowing and breaking the boundaries. So it's quite easy to morph that concept from Bein Adam L'Chaveroi in breaking boundaries of kindness to Bein Adam L'Makom. Someone who is saying, I want to keep halacha, my job is to keep halacha, I'm going to keep the law and nothing beyond it. He is a great person, they're doing everything they ought to do, fantastic. And then a chassid is someone who is going lifnim meshuras hadin, beyond the letter of the law, in chumrah or in hidur or in the like, someone who's breaking those boundaries and reaching beyond. The phraseology used is mischased im koino. They're doing almost a chesed with their creator. They're doing a chesed in their spiritual practices also. We find, for example, the Mishnah in Ovos. The Mishnah says, Loi am ha'oretz chassid. And am ha'oretz, an ignoramus, can't be a chassid. What does that mean to say? If you're ignorant, suffice with keeping halacha. Don't try and start caking on chumras and from practices and being frummer than everyone else and so on. Your focus is on keeping halacha. Lo amaret chassid. It doesn't make sense for an amaret. If you're a learned person, fine, you can begin exploring chassidus, going beyond the letter of the law. But if you're not, do what's right, and that's sufficient in your spiritual practice. The Gemara brings practices of Chassidim Harishonim, the early pietists, the early Chassidim. So he used to prepare 1 hour before davening. So most of us are proud of ourselves if we go to shul and we daven and we get through davening. The Chassidim Rishonim not. They come to shul an hour early. They prepare for davening for an hour. They meditate. They think about things. Then they daven, and then they need another hour afterwards, as it were, to come down from their spiritual heights. So Chassidus has now been used as a term for pietic practices, but also beginning to drift towards meditative and spiritual exercises. What are you doing for that hour? You're engaged in meditative and spiritual pursuits. So it begins morphing not just to general hidur and chumrah, but particularly to sort of spiritual practices and meditative practices and the like. By the way, the term Chassidim is used even pre-Mishnaic era. The Maccabeim are referred to in some contemporaneous sources as Chassidim. Why? Because they're the frummers. They're not happy to, compromise with the Greeks. We're Mila Shemila. We're going to go out and fight and so on. So they use that term Chassidim. Some of the breakaway sects from the Pharisees, from the Purushim, from what we would now call the Orthodox world, refer to themselves as Chassidim. So it's a term meaning extra piety, but by the Mishnaic era, it's beginning to drift towards particularly spiritual and mystical practices. Then we get to the Chassidei Ashkenaz. I think we have covered in this series. Again, they use the term Chassidei Ashkenaz. Who are they? These are Kabbalists in Germany, roughly contemporaneous with the Baal Tosfos. So the era of the generations following Rashi, and they introduce pietic practices, and some of them are very famous to this day. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. The Rokeach, you'll hear these works quoted. They're learning Kabbalah. They're engaging in extra piety, fasting, self-flagellation, extra stringency in halachic practice, and the like. Chassidei Ashkenaz. Okay, listen. Quick plug to the recording of Chassidei Ashkenaz for those who are interested in it. Did Chassidei Ashkenaz ever become a mass movement? We think not. We think it was always an elite movement, but there was a movement. Are there any links between the mystical pietic practices of Chassidei Ashkenaz and the rise of Chassidus? Possibly, probably not. It's possible that undercurrents of these Kabbalistic practices remained in the Jewish world for 300 years and migrated eastward when Western European Jewry migrated eastward. But there's no overt link. It was its own Chassidic movement that flourished for a short time in Germany and then more or less died off. There's other figures who were known throughout history as HaChassid. Why? Because people revered and respected their piety and their mystical practices. I'll just give you two examples of them. One of them is Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah is a Rishon in Spain, in Girona, and that's in Catalonia, and the northwest corner of Spain. And he is a classic Rishon. He writes halachic works. He writes commentaries on the Gemara. He also writes Mussar works, the Shari Teshuvah of Rabbeinu Yonah, and he's a first cousin of the Ramban and Nachmanides, and he is very pious. He's very holy, and he is known as Rabbeinu Yonah HaChassid. He's referred to by his contemporaries as a Chassid because he engages in mysticism and pietic practices. Then we have a very different figure, Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam. Rabbi Avraham, the son of the Rambam, is a student of his father. He is a philosopher, but his philosophy causes him to become a very spiritual person, a very meditative and reflective person. He adopts various philosophical meditative techniques. He develops his father's thinking and sort of creates a way of serving Hashem out of it. So the Rambam, as has become clear in this series, and anyone who reads Rambam, is a very abstract thinker. Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam, Rabbi Avraham, the son of the Rambam, takes these abstract philosophical ideas and creates out of that a spiritual way of life, a sort of spiritualist, revivalist movement, and writes an encyclopedic work of spiritual practices based on the teachings of his father, called Sefer Maspik L'Ovdei Hashem, a sefer of resources for one who wishes to serve God. We have a small section of it left. Most of it, unfortunately, got lost, and you can learn it. And it was translated from Arabic 80, 70 years ago. And he was known as Rabbi Avraham HaChassid. Have we ever done Rabbi Avraham and Rambam's life? Okay, we have to do it next on the list. Someone should keep notes of all these figures that we definitely need to learn Rabbi Avraham and Rambam. Amazing figure. But he's known as Rabbi Avraham HaChassid. In a moment, Charles, again, just an example of great figures throughout history who are known as Chassidim. Yes?
He, in fact, we have Sukkot from that he adopted Sufi.
Yes. Okay, you mustn't ruin the punchline of my series on Rabbi Avraham and Rambam. No, so I'm joking. No. Yeah. Okay. Of course, he's controversial. Rambam is controversial. Rambam is controversial. Very interesting thing. That's why I want to do a series on him. What you're saying is absolutely right, and we will. I'm teasing you. It's a wonderful comment. And when we do Rabbi Avraham and Rambam, we'll talk about him also. Okay. So the term Chassidus is a well-known term in the Jewish world, and we have some evidence that there are groups and clusters of individuals who call themselves Chassidim in East Europe, around and about East Europe, even after, well before the time of the Baal ShemTov. So the Baal ShemTov isn't the only spiritual teacher in the Jewish world, obviously. So if you're living in 1500 in Ukraine or Poland, you may know about clusters around a spiritual teacher who label themselves Chassidim. They mean to say that we are pietic groups who are trying to serve Hashem in a extraordinary manner, and either they'll label themselves or they'll be labeled by others as Chassidim. So you'll say, oh, in this particular village, there's a great sage and tzaddik, and he has an amazing followers, and the title you'll say is they are Chassidim. So it's a term that is floating around, but eventually, fast forward in time, the second and third generation of students of the Baal ShemTov, the movement begins becoming known as the Hasidic movement, and in a sense, ever since they own that title. So anyone else stops using that title, at least on a mass level. Interestingly, the main opponent of Hasidus, one of the main opponents of Hasidus, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Vilna, the title he's given by all his followers is Gaon HaChassid, because the title hasn't yet become loaded with the sort of later movement, and they saw their Rebbe as a Chassid. He wasn't just a genius; he was a person of incredible spirituality and incredibly great spiritual practices, and his students call him a Gaon HaChassid. That we refer to him as the Vilna Gaon, but they refer to him as the Vilna Chassid. I mean, the Vilna Gaon and Chassid. He was a practitioner of Chassidus because he also engaged in Kabbalah and Kabbalistic meditation and spiritual practices and the like. So that's the origin of the term Chassidus. The final thing I want to talk about before we finish today's show, and then next week we'll start talking about Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem's life himself, is the title Baal Shem. So what does the title Baal Shem mean, and what do we know about, why did he become known as the Baal ShemTov? So in West and East Europe, from the perhaps 1450s and on, there were groups of clusters or of individual Kabbalists who began becoming known as Baalei Shem. The reason they became known as Baalei Shem, probably the meaning of the title, is masters of the name with a capital N, meaning masters of God's name. Meaning to say that Kabbalah is many things. Kabbalah is a philosophical system in a sense. It's a set of beliefs about divinity and how God interacts with the world and what we can say about God himself. It's also a meditative system. You can engage in meditation and mystical meditation. It's a route to mysticism and mystical union with the divine. It's also perhaps a practical system, meaning claims are made by Kabbalists that they can use Kabbalistic insights to nudge the world into shape, to get the world to, I'll come to to get the world to do various things. In other words, if you understand the secrets of God's name, you can manipulate the world and create miracles or influences to happen by knowing the name of Hashem. Now, I want to emphasize this is not a sort of new Kabbalistic claim. We're kind of told these things in classic sources, we just don't put it all together. So, for example, we're told that Moshe Rabbeinu kills the Mitzri, and according to certain Midrashic sources, even brought in the Rishonim, he did so by saying the name of Hashem. So you see that names of Hashem can be used to do various things. Moving onwards in history, we learnt in a couple of weeks back the Sefer Yetzirah, which Gaon sees as a philosophical work, but the Kabbalists see as a Kabbalistic work. The Gemara already records that stories of Amoraim who could create a Golem type life force using Sefer Yetzirah, using God's creative power. So part of Kabbalistic claims are that if you understand mysticism and you understand the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu grants us the ability to use these names to affect outcomes. And from that emerges the Golem legends and stories, and I'll tell you in a moment about legends and stories, the accurate ones and the less accurate ones, and various other claims around the power of mystical practices. Now, what's important to emphasize is that theologically, this isn't seen as magic, because it isn't using negative forces. This is using avodas Hashem, service of Hashem and connection to Hashem. And therefore, to be a safe makubal, you have to do so you have to be an elevated person who genuinely is up for the task. And if you're not, then you're playing with fire. It can be very, very dangerous because you're using God's name for your own selfish needs. So this is the concept of Baal Shem. We'll come back to it in a moment, but Leonard, do you want to say something? Yes. Yes. That's only Shem. The mystics understand that to mean, for their own selfish needs and so on. Yeah. So around the practice of practical Kabbalah has always been a lot of debate and controversy because it's open to manipulation, it's open to fraud. To this day, unfortunately, there are pseudo-Kabbalists in Israel in particular, where research has indicated that they have accumulated millions of shekalim, some of them are exceptionally wealthy individuals, feeding off vulnerability and desperation. Very, very sad. So certainly before one ever dreams of going to see a practical Kabbalist, speak to a competent individual and do a lot of research and don't jump to conclusions about who this person is. But the reality is, to this day, there are practical Kabbalists, people out there who claim practical Kabbalistic influence. But it's a dangerous genre to get involved in because it's difficult to tell who is reliable, who isn't. And it's dangerous for the practitioner also to get yourself into trying to manipulate God's names if you're not up to the task, can be spiritually very damaging. Now, however we understand the phenomena, there are Kabbalists that arise in Europe in the 1600s, in other words, a couple of hundred years before the Baal Shem Tov, and these are known as Baalei Shem. Some of them, no doubt, reputable holy individuals who learn Kabbalah in depth and use their spiritual ability to try and bring healing to Jews who are unwell, security to Jewish communities in danger, and the like. And some of them, no doubt, fraudulent, either deceiving themselves and thinking that they're up to it, or just conmen. But this is a genre of spiritual practitioners floating around West and East Europe, known as Baalei Shem, masters of the name, and they some of them wander around and they faith heal and the like. Now, we know a fair amount about some of the later ones. In Germany, in the mid-1800s, there was still a Baal Shem operating, the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, an amazing figure, and he was contemporaneous with modernity, and we have records and enormous amounts of records about him and his activities, and so on. Germany in the 1800s was very interesting. There were very, very strong tides of modernity, but there were also little villages and sort of backwaters in Germany, which were still really Städtelach, very similar to what we would think of as East Europe, completely uninfluenced by modernity, and where Jews were still doing the same things they had done for hundreds of years, and in Michelstadt was flourishing a Baal Shem. There was a Baal Shem who moved to London, the Baal Shem of London, Falk his name was. He called himself Dr. Falk. As we saw, Baalei Shem were often named by non-Jews doctor because they were healers. And we don't know much about him. I have to be careful because I'm talking about someone many hundreds of years back. But as far as we can tell, he unfortunately was not a genuine person. As far as we can tell, he was somewhat of a fake. But I say that with hesitancy. I don't want to hear someone about whom we know very little. His main claim to fame is that his picture became very popularized and later was misascribed and became known as the picture of the Baal Shem Tov. So any picture, we have no picture of the Baal Shem Tov. We absolutely have no picture of the Baal Shem Tov. We, as I said, we barely have anything from him. But there is a very famous picture of the Baal Shem Tov floating around, and this picture is really the Baal Shem of London, not the Baal Shem Tov himself. Okay, so there are Baalei Shem who are floating around. We then discovered, I think we're talking about only about 20 years ago, going through the archives, a Russian-Ukrainian Jewish researcher discovered an amazing book called Sefer Cheshek, a book of a memoir of a Baal Shem. So now we have an amazing work. We're talking about hundreds of pages in which a Baal Shem writes about his life as a Baal Shem, his own inner workings. This Baal Shem is genuine in the sense that he believes what he's doing. Whether he really was or wasn't able to do the things he claims, who knows? But he's not a fake. He really believes in what he's doing. But also, I don't know how to phrase this. There's no great theological depth in his work, and he's quite bitter and burnt out. And basically, the theme of his book is my life is miserable, and no one really recognizes me, and I'm not very successful. Baalei Shem often had a very poor life. They didn't have a stella. They didn't have a position. They didn't become the rabbi of a city. They didn't get what's it called when a professor gets a permanent appointment. Sorry, no, not in English. What's it called? Sorry. That's a basic English word. I'm just blanking on it. Okay. Tenure. Thank you. Yeah, they didn't have tenure. They didn't have a proper position, like the Maggidim who wandered around from place to place. They were itinerants, it's called. They wandered around from place to place, and therefore, if they came somewhere and they were well received, then they would have livelihood. If they weren't well received, then they would be poor. It's very difficult because you're going from place to place. It's very hard to remain positive and spiritual when you have to promote yourself. And if you arrive in a place and no one knows who you are, you need people to know that you're a great Baal Shem, because you need people to flock to you for healing and for your lesson to be taught. But how do you avoid them just becoming a PR agent and becoming boastful? And then politics intrudes. If a Baal Shem arrives in a certain shtetl somewhere and he's very successful and very flourishing, well, other people that live in the town are the rabbi of the town going to be super happy about this? Are the dignitaries in the town going to be super happy about this? Don't forget, a world of limited resources. If people begin funding the Baal Shem, I'm sorry, can this little village sustain supporting another religious functionary? It already has to manage a sheikhet and a moyel and a chazan and a rav and a dayan and so on and so forth. Can they afford another religious figure? So at some point or other, he has to move out of town and go on to his next town. It's a very, very tough job. But there is a whole, we're not talking about massive numbers, but there are Bali Shem floating around East Europe, and it's a known role, as it were. So you have a Rav, you have a Chazan, you have a Mel, and you have a Baal Shem, and you have a Maggid. These are known East European and even West European roles that exist. Now, none of these figures were remotely capable, at least the ones we know of, I should say, the ones that we have record of, they're not capable of creating a new religious movement in the way that Baal ShemTov does, because what are they? They're not presenting a vision of, a new vision of Yiddishkeit. They're not presenting a new spiritual message. They're presenting little messages, healing and fixing things up. And often they have a lot of talk about demonic possession and fighting negative forces and, fixing yourself up in order to cure your illnesses and basic human needs that people want help with, spiritual needs, that livelihoods, health, children, and the like. They're offering healing for all these things. And this is what it means to be a Baal Shem. Our Baal Shem, the Baal ShemTov, Rabbi Yisroel of Baal Shem, seems to have, on some level or other, been developed within these intellectual circles, and possibly at the beginning of his life, possibly all the way through his life, functions in that sense as a Baal Shem. So he's doing healing. He's referred to in the local tax records as Dr. Baal Shem. We have records of him engaged in healing and the like. But at some point or other, his vision and his leadership and his message expands, and no longer is he just a faith healer. No longer is he talking much about fighting demonic possession. No longer, I'll come to a moment. No longer is he just trying to fix particular things, but he is preaching a far grander, deeper spiritual vision. And at that point, his movement takes off. His movement takes off. He does achieve tenure. He is given a official role within Mezeritch, and that gives him a base, and he now begins attracting students, and a far more profound spiritual message begins emerging, which wows people. And as I said, his first generation of students are a remarkable individual, great Talmidei Chachamim who emerge from his teaching influenced. So he makes the transition from being a regular Baal Shem, who is part of the sort of this movement, to someone who's teaching something far different and far more profound and far more spiritual. And out of that, the revolution emerges. What we need to do next week is start again, look at his upbringing, look at his influences, of which Baal Shem are amongst them, and look at into how he then developed to the extraordinary Baal ShemTov. How learned was he in classic learning? Was he also a regular Talmid Chacham? Was he a posek? Or was he a mystic just? What else do we know about him? Is he mentioned at all by other contemporaneous Talmidei Chachamim? And the answer to all of that is yes, yes, yes. We all the rumors to the contrary are incorrect. He was a Talmid Chacham, he was a dignitary, he was very educated, and I know that even 30 years ago all this stuff was denied by the academics, but the academic picture of Baal ShemTov and the traditional picture of the Baal ShemTov in many ways have become much closer over the last 30 years, and that's what we'll look at, please God, next week. Sorry, Peter, did you want to say something? No? Okay, I was misreading your body language, I thought you were going to say something. Okay. Fine, okay. Okay, so that's where we'll stop for today. I wish everyone a good morning, and next week we'll begin looking at his... There's a slight chance, by the way, just watch this space, there's a slight chance that there won't be a shir next week. We have our youth Shabbaton next Shabbos, and the program carries on to Sunday morning, and I still have to work out what part I'll be there for. So there's a slight part, there's a chance, and 2 weeks' time is on. It's definitely on, yeah. But maybe next week. Anyway, so that's where we're up to in contextualizing Baal ShemTov. I wish everyone a good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.